Hi guys, I'm back. I'm ready for chapter 2. I hope that you are. Um, Chapter 2 is a little bit longer than chapter 1, but that will be fine. Um, we learned in the last chapter that Mrs. Warren hired Mary on the spot. We learned that this is a true story. We learned that this takes place in the early 1900s. They didn't know a lot about disease back then. They didn't know how things passed from person to person like we do now. So keep that in mind as we move forward, because what we know about diseases and the exchange of germs is different from what they thought 115 years ago. So, to begin, chapter 2, in which the Warrens get more than their just desserts. Sorry. Pardon me. Mary Mallon packed her belongings and traveled by train to Oyster Bay, a popular vacation town on Long Island. She found her way to a large yellow house with tall windows and graceful arches and a wraparound porch at the corner of East Main Street and McCoon's Lane. The house sat on an ample, well-manicured grounds that sloped down to the bay. It stood at the edge of the town just before East Main Street curved into the woods, hugging the shoreline as it passed another manor and mansions. Mr. Charles Eliot Warren had rented the house for the summer. A cook's life wasn't easy, but here there was no dingy flat on the lower. Dingy flat on the Lower East Side where immigrants like Mary lived. There was no sweltering city heat and crowded streets and noise and squalor. In Oyster Bay, the smell of ocean was so strong you could taste it in the air. On sunny days, sailboats bloomed in the harbor. Fishermen pulled off soft clams from their sandy beds. Seagulls wheeled overhead and complained, and then rose up and wheeled and complained some more. As Mary settled into her new job, no one cared that she kept to herself and spoke little, for she kept her hands and fingers busy in the kitchen, showing off her culinary skills. Hand-cranked rotary beaters and peelers made some tasks easier, but she did most of the work by hand. The mixing, the rolling, the kneading, the beating, the paring of vegetables, and the slicing of apples and peaches. Cooks like Mary also washed dishes, swept and scrubbed the kitchen and the storeroom, and cleaned and polished the stove. If Mary knew why Mrs. Warren fired the previous cook, she never said, and she probably never asked. Some who knew Mary called her intelligent, but non-communicative. They also said she had a violent temper and could silence a person with a glare. Mary never talked much and never, ever talked about herself or her past. She kept to herself, minded her own business, and tended to the matters of the kitchen. These were the traits of a good servant. A good servant didn't wag her tongue about her employers. What happened in the house stayed in the house. It was better that way. So now we know a little bit more about Mary. Each morning, Mary rose early, never later than 6 a.m. She emptied her chamber pot into the servants' outdoor privy and washed her hands at the cold water tap in the kitchen. With no hot water faucet, she kept water heated on the stove. She used an all-purpose store-bought bar soap that she also scraped into the wash water for dishes. The harsh soap turned her hands red and raw. Once the stove was lit and the dirtiest work done, Mary changed into a clean cotton dress, pinned her hair into a tight knot, and donned a clean white cap. She looped her white cook's apron around her neck and tied it up around her waist. She lined her bowls and spoons and knives and other cooking utensils on the wooden work table. She had 11 mouths to feed, including the Warren family and their 5 household servants. An early start to the day was the only way to get the job done. It was hard work to prepare all of those meals, morning, noon, and night, and even harder when the Warrens entertained guests and threw lavish dinner parties. Before breakfast, a cook was also expected to clean the hall, the entrance, and the dining room. Even though the house was large, the kitchen was probably small. A well-appointed kitchen of the time had a gas stove. By 1906, 1/3 of all homes had replaced their coal and wood stoves with gas. It had a sink with a counter or drain board, a wooden table, and an easy-to-scrub linoleum floor. Some kitchens had cupboards, but most had open shelves and a large piece of furniture called a kitchen piano. It was a tall wooden hutch with a wooden surface and drawers and cupboards for holding sugar, flour, salt, spices, milk, eggs, and molasses. Extra provisions were stored in the kitchen pantry. There were no refrigerators or freezers. A porcelain enamel-lined icebox usually stood on the back porch. Here, the milkman could easily deposit the milk, and the iceman could leave a block of ice. The ice cost about 5 cents, as much as $1.43 today, for 15 pounds. The ice lasted up to several days, depending on its weight, the outdoor temperature, and how often the icebox was opened. The cook ruled the kitchen. Mary ordered the food and made sure nothing was wasted. She used the freshest ingredients: meat from the local butcher, bread from the local bakery, fruit from nearby orchards, vegetables from town gardens, milk and eggs and butter from a nearby dairy. With these ingredients, Mary made delicious roasts, moist cakes, smooth puddings, and her specialty, homemade ice cream. Thrift was an art. Though the Warrens didn't worry about money, Mr. Warren was vice president of the Lincoln National Bank in Manhattan and a banker to the Vanderbilts, one of the wealthiest American families. A good cook found a use for every leftover, every crumb. Bread was dried and grated into breadcrumbs for puddings and stuffing and to thicken meat gravies. Toast was transformed into griddle cakes and bread pudding. Meat bones flavored bean soup. Leftover vegetables were added to the soup pot. Fish and potatoes were fried in steak drippings. Tongue-tied. Sour milk was curdled into cottage cheese. Leftover potatoes reappeared as potato cakes. Not even eggshells were discarded. They were used to clarify or remove the sediment from broth, jellies, and coffees. Interesting. One Sunday, about 3 weeks after Mary's arrival, she poured fresh cream and milk and sugar into the inner metal chamber of the ice cream maker. She packed the barrel with ice and salt and cranked the handle. For several minutes, the cream mixture churned into smooth, creamy ice cream. She cut up fresh peaches and folded them in, too. That summer, the peaches were especially sweet and succulent. The largest and finest peaches that have been shown in town this season, boasted a local orchardist in the Long Islander newspaper. Mary scooped the ice cream into dishes and set the dishes on a serving tray. A maid served the dessert to the Warren family. That night, there was enough for everybody, the family and the servants. Even the gardener would get dessert. Ice cream was the perfect end to a summertime meal, as it required no cooking. And no matter how much you've eaten, there's always room for ice cream. The Warrens and the servants may have oohed and awed about the dessert, something Mary served in nearly every household where she worked. They may have also gossiped about the orchardist, so proud of his peaches he had presented a basket to them. To President Theodore Roosevelt, who was summering just a few miles away at Sagamore Hill. After the dinner party, Mary prepared her work for the next day. She washed up the plates and dishes, scrubbed the pots and pans, hung the jugs, cleaned the stove, and put everything in its place. Perhaps before retiring to bed, Mary stole a moment to stand on the huge wraparound porch. Perhaps she breathed in the briny scent of the bay that stretched all the way from Long Island Sound to the Atlantic Ocean. Perhaps in that moment she allowed her mind to travel back to Ireland, from where she had immigrated alone as a young teenager. To her employers and fellow workers, Mary never spoke of her growing up years. Most of what we know about her comes from a few documents, from what others say about her, and a 6-page letter written in her own hand. From Mary's death certificate, we know that she was born on September 23rd, 1869, in Ireland. Her parents were John Mallon and Catherine Eagle. From other records, we're told she was born in Cookstown, County Tyrone, in 1883, sometime before or after her 15th birthday. She boarded a steamship and sailed to America. She lived in New York City with her aunt and uncle. They died not long after her arrival, leaving her alone in a new country as a teenager. We don't know why Mary left Ireland or whom she left behind. We know that her parents survived the Great Famine of 1845 to 1850, a time when the potato crops failed and 1 million poor people died from starvation or starvation-related diseases. In Northern Ireland, County Tyrone lost at least 10% of its population. Most countries lost much more. Perhaps Mary hoped for a better life in America. We know that Mary could read and write and do sums, which means math, as could 73% of her peers in Ireland, where the literacy rate was 10% below that of the United States. We know she could sew and crochet. She did all of these things well. We don't know how Mary learned to cook. In New York City, she probably started out in smaller homes, first washing clothes, then ironing and cleaning. We know she was extremely proud of her work. Her employers called her a hard worker and often took her on vacation with them so that she could cook for them. From later accounts, when Mary worked in a hospital children's ward, we know that she liked children and they liked her. Often the children will have no one else to take care of them when they are sick, Mary told the New York World Reporter. We don't know why Mary distanced herself from her Irish past. Was she escaping painful memories? Was she escaping shameful memories? Whatever her reasons, perhaps distance helped her cope, manage, and survive. We know that Mary never lost her lilting Irish brogue, though it softened over the years. It was part of Ireland she carried with her always, the only part of her past she revealed to others. In Oyster Bay, Mary settled into a daily routine, preparing elaborate meals for the Warren family and less elaborate and less expensive meals for the servants. One day toward the end of August, 9-year-old Margaret Warren felt too tired and listless to run and play with her sister and brothers. She complained of a headache. Her mother touched her cheek and noticed that Margaret felt warm. She was running a fever and suffering from diarrhea. More than likely, Mrs. Warren didn't worry at first. Summer diarrhea in children was a common problem, according to a popular advertisement. All that is necessary is a few doses of Chamberlain's colic, cholera, and diarrhea remedy, followed by a dose of castor oil to cleanse the system, promised an advertisement in the town newspaper. The remedy was available for just 25 cents from a local pharmacy. Over the coming days, as Mary stirred the soup and peeled carrots and potatoes, as she mixed puddings and cakes and sliced peaches and early apples, Margaret grew worse. Her fever persisted, spiking as high as 105 degrees and causing delirium. The maids pressed cool cloths to the little girl's forehead. They may have plunged her into a cold bath to bring down the fever. But Margaret's lingering cough grew deeper, and a headache pounded her skull like a hammer. The little girl's diarrhea grew bloody and foul. With each bout, the maids stripped the beds and hustled the soiled sheets downstairs to be laundered. Mary kept pots of water boiling on the stove. Someone, the maids or a laundress, scrubbed the sheets and hung them to dry. The maids ran upstairs for fresh sheets. And then news of the telltale skin rash flashed through the house. Right away, Mrs. Warren sent for the doctor. The doctor confirmed the diagnosis. Margaret was stricken with typhoid fever, a highly contagious, deadly intestinal disease that killed 1 out of 5 victims. In 1906, there was no immunization to protect people from this disease. The vaccine would not be discovered until 1911. There was no cure. Antibiotics wouldn't be discovered until 1942, and an antibiotic specifically for typhoid fever, chloromycin, wouldn't be developed until 1949. All the Warrens could do was treat the symptoms and wait, and hope and pray. If Margaret survived, she would have natural immunity to the disease. Within the week, 5 more people fell ill. Mrs. Warren, Margaret's older sister, 2 maids, and the gardener. 2 were sent to the local hospital. Local doctors treated the others. Convinced that the drinking water was contaminated, the most common cause of the disease, the Warrens packed up and hurried back to the safety of their townhouse in the Upper East Side in New York City. Margaret's 2 brothers were sent to stay with relatives in New Jersey until the danger passed. Mary Mallon didn't follow the Warrens to their brownstone home. Perhaps her services as a cook were no longer needed. Perhaps she found a better offer. Perhaps she feared that she would catch the terrible disease herself. Perhaps she considered it terribly bad luck that typhoid fever broke out in so many households in which she worked. What Mary's reasons were, we don't know. We won't ever know. She never said. Mary was private and minded her own business. She expected others to do the same. That was a longer chapter, so that's the only one we're going to read right now. Now it's kind of getting interesting because it said maybe that happened in more than one household that she worked in. So yeah, think about it. Wonder about it. Do you think that it could have had anything to do with her cooking or the way she was preparing food in some way, that it somehow worked its way to all of these people? Or do you think, knowing what we know now about germs, that it passed between the people in the household that way? Think about it. Bye.